Well, Mort's Dev Hour Gizmos and Gadgets Learning came out today, and I thought I'd take a minute to react to this as a master's level player. I did read through this at least briefly before getting on, so I do have some thoughts, but for the most part, I'm just kind of reacting fresh to this. As I said, I am a master's level player. I will be reacting sort of based on my own personal perspective. I don't claim to be anything higher than that. So there, you might have very different thoughts if you are someone of a much higher rank or even a much lower rank, and that's totally okay. I think it's important that we have different perspectives about the game, and sometimes we can focus a little bit too hard on maybe the top challenger level as well as maybe even sometimes the lower levels, the extreme lower levels. And I think it's just important for everyone to talk about this. So I'm just going to go through and kind of read through some things that I find interesting. The start of this, him looking back on the everything coming off of set five, which I think pretty much everyone can agree set five was a bit of a mess, especially set five. I think things did get fixed quite a bit in 5.5, but overall, I think the set was a bit of a disaster. Mort has said that. I think most people agree with that. And they kind of had a big deal going into this set, into set six, of fixing that. So mechanical complexity, after coming off the complex shadow and radiant items, augments a mini-use success for providing clear power and strategic decision making in game variants. I kind of agree with that. I think we're getting a lot closer to that, and later on in this, he will talk about how this is sort of augments 1.0. This was sort of their first version of it. I do think augments overall have done some very good things for the game. I also think they've done some very bad things, and I do think they suffer from a similar problem that shadow items had. And I don't think it's complexity. I have contended for a long time that shadow items, the problems with them had less to do with the complexity of them and the sort of risk reward nature of them, and more to do with the lack of a single clear direction about what they are supposed to be. Shadow items were, in some cases, very risky items with big benefits. In some cases, totally new items that did something totally different than the original item. And in some cases, just better versions of the item that already existed. And I thought that lack of direction made it a lot harder for players, especially newer and lower level players, to get a feel for like what a shadow item is supposed to be. Shadow Zeke's is not a support item. It's the opposite. It's actually like the best attack speed item in the game, which is really cool. Shadow Zeke's was a fun build to put on certain units, but it did basically nothing to do with what a regular Zeke's Herald was. So you as a player were like, oh, I have to completely learn this new item and how different it is. While something like Shadow Rageblade, which was not very good, was like this riskier version of Rageblade that you got a little bit more power, but you also dealt damage to yourself. And it's like those two things are not the same, and they didn't stick with that. I think augments have kind of fallen a little bit prey to that problem too, where I'm still not 100% sure what augments are supposed to be. Are augments supposed to be the main decision making factor? Your augments should dictate exactly how you play the game, and you should be making pick your augments and then make decisions off of that? Or are augments supposed to be sort of little increases in power that you can play around, or you can kind of choose to ignore a little bit? This is kind of bit of a problem when you go from silver to gold to prismatic, and just different augments. You have some augments that need to be completely played around, something like Built Different, something like March of Progress, which require you to fundamentally change the way you play the game. And then you have other augments like Celestial or I don't know, Celestial is kind of the obvious, like Thrill of the Hunt, for instance, that are just sort of, you can put them in most comps. Yes, they technically are better in some comps than others, but at the most part, basically any comp can have some free healing. So it's like you just kind of take the augment and play the game relatively normally. And I think we really need to get to a place where we decide on one design direction for augments. I think we are moving in that direction. I think some of the decisions they've made about limiting when augments can show up, limiting what your board state needs to be for certain augments, and the timing has been really good. But I still think we have a long way to go on that. Balance thrashing. They talked about this a ton. The set 5 had just a lot of these massive swings back and forth. I think they did a pretty good job on this set. Unique traits. They tried to introduce some more unique traits. I think Some of the unique traits were kind of better and worse for the game. These are experiments, which is good. 5 costs, that's fine. The rank climb, this is something I want to talk about a lot, and I think is an important thing to talk about because this is something that does not affect GM and above players, or even, masters like 100 LP above players, because the fact is they, and now me, as I've now gotten over 200 LP this season for the first time, don't actually have to deal with the ranked ladder in the same way, because it just fundamentally masters and above is a different ladder system. It's LP thresholds. You can go up 100, you can go up 300 LP, go down 300 LP, and not actually change your rank. But for everyone below that, and admittedly, I had a lot of trouble getting back to Masters in set 6 and spent a lot of time sort of bouncing between Diamond 1 and Diamond 3. I have a lot of issues with the way that the ranked system works. This, getting rid of demotions, absolutely huge win. I'm so glad they did this. It makes the game so much more enjoyable. I am 100% the person who hit Masters and then just stopped playing on my main account because I was like, well, I've gotten as high as I'm going to go. I have no desire to get demoted and have to get climbed back up. I'll take my rank rewards, and what the hell? I'll play on another account. I'll play, maybe I'll play on Europe. Maybe I'll just play on a Smurf. Maybe I'll just mess around, or maybe I just won't even play the game for a while. This is not a big deal if you end up getting your final promotion in the last couple of weeks, but if you hit your promotion with 2.5 months to go, you're like, wow, am I even really trying to play the game? This has given me a lot less ladder anxiety, although I still have a ton, to just kind of play the game. Weirdly enough, I've had this happen, I believe, only one time where I have lost a game at 0 LP in Masters. I think it happened once where I could have gotten demoted but didn't. So it's not even something that's happened a lot. It's a lot more of a just a feeling. That said, I don't really understand why people don't like this. I think this is just one of those elitist things. And the fact of the matter is, we'll talk about, because he gets into the MMR problem in a bit, is actually not a thing, because if your MMR is going down and making you unable to climb, that would have happened anyway, because your LP would have gone down. That's it. I don't have really any thoughts on Hyperroll. I really just don't play Hyperroll at all, so I'm not really going to talk about it. Variance and novelty augments it a lot for G&G by adding more possibilities and combinations to the game. I understand why variance is very important. The game can get stale if you're playing things the same every game, but I do think we need to be a little bit careful as to what we mean when we say variance, because it's a word that can have a lot of definitions, and two, augments sometimes don't do this as well as I think that they always do. Item system pain points, I agree with this 100%. I think this is a big issue of when you get a bunch of components at 4-7. It is a little bit of a meta thing, because if, for pretty much all of set 6, we've been in a meta where you want to be going 8 and rolling before final PvE round. And if you're only going to get 1 or 2 items on that, it's not really a big deal. But often that's not true, especially with armories not being in the game at this point. So it has been an issue, and I think this is something I really would like them to fix. Granted, I also think it'd be nice to look at the PvE rounds after stage 4-7, because there are ones on stage 5 and stage 6 where you get the last Whisperer and you already have one, or you're playing an AP comp and you're like, well, this item does legitimately nothing for me. Spatula and emblems. I've been talking about this for a long time. I have not been impressed with spatulas and emblems in the last 2 sets. They've been honestly pretty boring. 6.5 has been a little bit better in terms of making more playable emblems. I think it's a little bit less of an issue. In set 6, I just hated spats and would basically not take them, because there were just so few comps that actually could make use of them. There were a few good ones. Academy stat was pretty good. Chemtech spat, if you were playing Chemtech, was nice, but there was just not really that many there weren't that many really interesting ones. And quite frankly, there were some comps that just could not make use of them. Jin comps really could not use spats. It was just basically a dead item, and that's not good. We don't want spats to be dead items. The biggest thing I don't understand is why there was not a generic defensive spatula in set 6 at all. Most other sets we've had at least something, whether it's Cavalier spat in set 5, Vanguard, something like Vanguard Spat, things like that, where you were like, you could at least make something that's like, all right, it's not great, but if nothing else, I'll get an extra Cavalier and I'll run Rel. Like, there just wasn't that. There was no Bruiser Spat. There was no, what are we talking about? Bodyguard Spat, things like that. So that, like, I don't really understand at times why, like, yeah, Gemini was the new trait in 6.5, but like, Chain Vest is the spat for Debonair, a trait that has nothing to do with armor. Like, if we just had Bodyguard Spat, it's like, okay, great. We can just, every comp can probably run Braum. So if you need to, you take a spat, you throw a chain on it, you make Bodyguard Spat, and your Braum is a little bit tankier in taunts. Great. I don't understand why that was the case. And I think going forward, I understand that, like, that's not an exciting thing, but I think we do need to be just, like, have something to allow just, like, this is a general use case of a spat. Because, yeah, Arcanist spat is really good. But you know what Arcanists need? A lot of rods. They can't always spare one, and now you just have, like, Arcanist takes a spat, and, like, you have to choose between Arcanist spat and Gunblade. Well, Gunblade's really important, or Jeweled Gauntlet, if, we're back in set 6. So let's move forward into actually, talking through what he said. So mechanic complexity and sort of the issue that, like, if augments become a recurring core mechanic of TFT, does this leave room for adding new things to the game? I think this is a legitimate concern, and I think we do need to be careful with their focus on novelty as being an important thing. Augments are, still relatively new. We've only had them for a single set. I will be very curious to see where we are at the end of set 7, as, like, are augments still this super new thing that adds a lot of complexity and adds a lot of uniqueness, or do they begin to get stale? Obviously, part of the joy of augments is you can just make a whole bunch of new augments and take a bunch of older ones out of the game, and that adds something. But at the end of the day, one thing I've seen over and over from them adding these kind of new things, at the end of the day, if you just keep adding new and new stuff, one, there's going to be issues. Like, there's just going to be mistakes, and that happens. It's not a huge deal. But there's going to need to be certain generic augments in order to keep the system from being completely unwieldy. And I'll be curious to see where it is, because I have personally felt that augments have begun to get, at times, a little bit stale. Like, we've seen Thrill of the Hunt, we've seen Celestial, we've seen, Knife's Edge so many times. We know what those things do, and it's just not that big a deal. Interesting that Caitlyn is here as the sort of balanced thrashing thing as we go on, because Katarina is kind of like the real, I think, one of the biggest problems I saw in the set when Katarina was running wild for that one set 6 meta. And one thing that Mort had said during the postmortem of that patch or the patch afterwards, where Katarina got nerfed and, like, immediately became the worst unit in the game. This is something that I think we need to talk about going forward, is the balanced thrashing, not just in terms of patches, but in terms of trait design, because there are certain traits, Assassin, that lend themselves to a lot of balanced thrash. Aurelia is another really good example of this, where you have these certain traits then in which units have thresholds. If they get over a certain threshold, they are simply overpowered, and if they are below that threshold, they kind of don't do anything. Basically, any kind of reset champ like Aurelia, and then assassins that are so dependent upon one-shotting things because of their frailty and the amount of built-in damage amp that comes from them being entirely dependent on crit, creates this world where there's just not that much they can do. It's not so much a problem with the actual patches. It's not that Katarina was over buffed and then over nerfed. It's more of just that the fundamental design of Katarina was absolutely overpowered carry or worthless trait bot that occasionally goes into Academy or Assassin. And that kind of just is just not something I think that they can deal with on, like, a patch to patch basis, but needs to be looked at and more of, like, a holistic thing in terms of the set, and having a better example of, like, understanding, okay, when we have a threshold champ like Aurelia, which we had in the game before, she is a reprint, and, we've seen this kind of thing happen. Like, Talon from set 4 is kind of one of the best examples of this, where a unit that just like got a little bit of a buff, which actually was supposed to be a nerf, and suddenly completely overtook the meta because as long as he's one-shotting things, he jumps around and kills the entire board, and there's literally nothing you can do. That was the Aurelia meta. She was just completely overpowered and could just dart around the board and kill basically everything. Once she got nerfed, Aurelia carry basically fell out of the meta entirely. We watched Worlds, and I don't remember seeing a single full-on Aurelia carry during the entire. Maybe it happened once or twice, but like this really strong carry that was in the game for like a month because of a long patch was just gone. And again, I don't actually blame the balance patch. I blame the fundamental design of Aurelia. That said, I like that they continue this light touch to balancing. I think they're always going to be in the biggest problem when they try to do big patches and buff and nerf a bunch of stuff at the same time. That has always been the worst patches in the history of TFT. So light touch is good. Overall, I think the balance of set 6 and 6.5 was mostly pretty good. I think they did a very good job of up and down. Even the Kai'Sa meta, I don't actually think was as bad as people think it was, at least regarding Kai'Sa. I think the problem was like Yordle and Merc and the amount of econ in the game, a lot more so. But in general, I think it's the next sort of phase of dealing with the balance thrash problem is fixing this problem of having really hard to balance champions. Unique traits. Yeah, I was never the biggest believer that set 5's problem was the like unique trait issue. I think yes, there were a lot of traits that just gave a bunch of stats, but I think there were just a lot of other problems with set 5. Maybe my biggest just being it launched in a really terrible state. And hell, one of the more unique traits that they had, Coven, was the source of a huge balance problem because of Shadow Blue Buff LeBlanc. So I will continue to say I think this was somewhat of the wrong lesson to learn from the problem set 5, that like traits need to be super unique. So I don't care about this too much. That being said, they tried some things. Colossus, I am not a fan of Colossus. I think one, it kind of falls into this problem here where Colossus was sort of fundamentally hard to balance because of this 2-unit problem. If you know how Colossus, if they are too strong, become unbelievably cost efficient because you only need 3 of them to 2-star unit instead of 6 for 2-unit spots, or they become incredibly weak once you get into the late game and you're just not as worried about the cost efficiency. So I'm not a huge fan of Colossus. I think it was like kind of I would not want to see this type of thing in the game again, but they tried something new, which was kind of cool. Innovator, I mean, Innovator is just another variant on our summon a unit. I don't really know why Innovator is significantly more interesting than Mech or Moonlight or Cultist or Abomination before it. It's the same type of trait. It's fine. This has clearly become a mainstay. It continues to be about a balance nightmare, and I kind of would really be interested to see if they can find one. I mean, Cultist was just kind of bad, to be honest, but I'd be curious to see if they can actually fix this. But this one doesn't really feel that unique to me. Mutant was cool. Mutant was weird. I mean, set 6 Mutant was odd in that because there was no real AD Mutant other than maybe Cho'Gath, was kind of a bunch of them were like really weird, like Cybernetics and Blade Master, where you were kind of like, I don't really know why I would ever want to run these, because so many of the mutants are just like tanks or AP. While then you get like Synaptic, which was, this is perfect for Malzahar. This was fine. I think the biggest thing that we've seen, the biggest problem with Mutant was just like occasionally the balance on of certain ones got very out of whack. We saw it at Worlds with Darkstar. We saw it during regionals with Synaptic. I think clearly Mort had said something that they didn't have great test tools for seeing what mutant trait there was in terms of their data. It seems like they got better with that as time went on. I think that's just very important. If you're going to do a trait like this, you need to be very careful to like make sure we're paying attention to the different variants, because it is easy for something to slip under the rug because one, players have a lot less time. It takes a lot longer for players to get the number of games to do the testing. Like, you don't see Synaptic Mutant that often, so you can't just like, okay, I'm gonna every game go in and like limit test Synaptic Mutant. We have, it only happens once every 6 games, sometimes less than that. And two, because it doesn't happen as often, it's not gonna look to be as big of a problem because you're not gonna see it literally every game, even though, oh my god, it actually is crazy overpowered, and when you get in one of those lobbies, they're just awful. Another underrated thing is the fact that when one of the mutants is overpowered, again, I'm going to continue to say Synaptic and Darkstar, it creates this compounding issue where players feel they really need to play it because, oh, everyone's talking about how good Synaptic Mutant is. If I don't play it this game, I might not see Synaptic Mutant for another 2 weeks because I don't play that many games, which leads to even more people trying out the broken thing and making the lobbies even more of a problem. So I think that's another thing that we just don't need to be careful with. Merc, I mean, I have a pretty long history of complaining about Mercenary. Once again, it's kind of weird to say unique loss streak style comp, considering it's Fortune, but slightly worse for the game, in my opinion. So, I'm glad. It sounds like Merc will not be in the next set, so that's good. Scrap, I really like Scrap. Scrap is one of the coolest traits they've ever made. I think the whole changing your items is super awesome. Yes, was broken at the end, and Echo is a big problem, and the shielding part of it was something they probably can look at. But this type of thing, super unique, super cool. Loved it. I'm really, really glad they put that in the game. Socialite, I've complained a lot about Socialite. I don't really love the degree to which the spot, locking you into a spot can really fundamentally change the way certain comps can and can't play. I also just don't like that there are certain spots that are just like functionally less usable. One, for instance, with Share the Spotlight. Like if you get like when you get Share the Spotlight as your first augment, like I don't feel like I can take it, despite it being really good. Because what if it's the top right corner and I basically can't get a full complement of hexes? That was really annoying. The combination of Silco and Socialite's a weird thing where like if Socialite's the back spot, you can't use Silco with that unit, which might not be a huge deal, but it's like a little weird that the trait, like it's not like it's this sort of game to game variance that's like just like very built in, and I'm not overly in love with it. I also think there's another problem that I've talked about a little bit, and it goes with some augments, where I don't love how much positioning can sometimes be just locked in. If you're playing 3 or even 5 Socialite, that's your positioning. Your best unit is there. There's nothing, like you can't give up that value by not putting your unit there, which means that's your positioning. Something like Exiled or something like Keepers or Knife's Edge or Battle Mage basically lock you into a positioning, and Sniper's Nest being another great one where it's like you just don't have the ability to move your units around, and that can be kind of like I think take a little bit of depth out of the game, which I don't love. So I think overall interesting idea, could use some refinement, and I think again kind of compounded with some other things. Overall, so Striker is interesting because this is hearing sort of the unique trait thing. I don't have a problem with Striker being super simple. I have a problem with Striker being a flat AD trait that I think we have now learned with Sivir is like maybe just fundamentally bad, because the way that flat AD works is probably just not like creates this weird problem where like Sivir 1 is dominating because she can get so much AD off of her trait that 2-starring her is kind of not as relevant as it should be. This is just like a thing that we see with flat AD it's basically the only trait, like the only thing that does that, because AD is one of the only traits that like, or only stats that fundamentally we know always scales with star level, and like at its core I think this is just probably not great. So overall, like I've been very critical of 6.5, and I think some of the trait issue is this, and like there is a little bit of the, was Silco worth it? Was Silco worth having Striker? I think Striker's problems maybe were more to do with the fact that they chose flat AD as the stat and not something else. But I do think that in general, I look at traits as kind of a more important thing than units, because the traits sort of affect, because traits affect more units in a weird way. So like Striker being super boring kind of makes Aurelia and Sivir and Jarvan and Rek'Sai and a Spat boring, while Silco is like a thing that happens at the very end of the game and is like kind of less important. That being said, it's Silco from Arcane. It's really cool. I don't really have any thoughts about the 5 costs. I think the 5 costs are fine. I mean, there are issues with individual ones, but that's not really the issue. The rank climb. So I mentioned this a little bit up at the top, but I want to talk about this a little bit more. Sort of this part of it here, and just overall the rank system in general. I think this is maybe the biggest, one of the biggest things that they can improve on, and probably one of the things that will take the least work to improve. I think there's just a lot of very simple things that they can do to fix this. One, right off the bat, we sort of have these two systems. We have hidden MMR and we have your visible rank. And I think especially for players who are, again, diamond and below, I don't really think these things I think we need to just spend a lot more time with the fact that this is cosmetic. Your visible rank is at its core not the same thing as your MMR, and we should be willing to just let this be a much more forgiving system. Your MMR, the thing that actually determines who you play and actually where you rank, should be the thing that can be far more, kind of capricious and actually, accept things. One thing I find really frustrating. I really hate the fact that your LP, for instance, is not at all tied to number of games. If you play 4 games and you go 4th, 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 1st, sorry, 4th, 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 8th, the 8th counts just the same as those 4th because it's basically exclusively on average placement. Assuming your MMR is normal, you will go plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, that's plus 30, and then minus 40. Congratulations, you played 4 games. 4 of them you played well, 1 of them you played poorly, and yet you're negative for the day. Now, average placement, that absolutely is true. But there's more to it than that. And I think that this should just be cosmetic. Your visible rank, make this far more fun, far more engaging, and just don't worry about, well, it maybe inflates your rank a little bit. I don't care. I think people talk about ranked inflation like it's some massive problem. If a few players are sort of sitting at bronze 2 and now they're in bronze 1, it doesn't hurt anyone. It doesn't make this worse. If we increase the percentages of ranks by 1 or 2%, the idea, there's some people out there that seem to think, oh my God, everyone will just be will be challenger. That's not at all what I'm saying. And again, be very clear. I am talking about sort of, diamond and below, or sort of, the cusp of diamond and masters and below. I still think there is a ton they can do to fix this. Once you get into GM and challenger, that's fine. Hell, I think once you get into GM and challenger, maybe you should just make MMR not hidden and make it based on MMR. That should be the thing that determines how, where your placement is at the top of the ladder. Because, and they do that in other games. StarCraft 2 is a good example of it, where it's like, that's where players can be, your challenger players, they're much more able to accept the confusingness that might be minute differences in MMR. Your bronze players don't care about that. Just make this better. But the biggest takeaway here is I'm very happy that they are working on ways to improve this. So this is something I wanted them to do. I'm really glad. As I said, going forward, as I said before, I don't play hyper roll, so I'm not really going to talk about that. I just think that they didn't mention double up at all here. They only mentioned hyper roll as their lab for this set. Variance and novelty, they want to cut down on reprints of 3 and 4 cost champions. I think this is the biggest key, especially if they were in a recent set. I don't think Draven would have been as big of a deal if Draven wasn't in set 5. Draven was in set 5 and then was in set 6. That was a very quick turnaround. So I think, 2 sets in a row is probably important. But again, I think it's weird because we're talking about Draven as the sort of an example of, yeah, Draven's fun, but it turns out not to be good. Draven was also kind of bad for a good portion of this set because of a lot of, because of a bunch of issues. Plus, Draven was this weird version of like, why was Draven a challenger when he gets infinite range off of VIP? Like, challengers' whole thing is they have their dash, which means Draven drops his axes, which means, and then never happens if he has infinite range. It's like, why was Draven challenger? Why was Draven debonair? A trait that's health and AP. And technically, yes, Draven scales pretty well on AP, but like, Draven's supposed to be the big AD champion. Why is Draven this champion that's like should be off of AP? That's very weird. And I think like this is sometimes I think an issue that they can have where they will sometimes learn, I think, the wrong lesson, where I think the lesson here is less Draven was a reprint and people didn't like have fun with him, so that's bad. And instead say Draven was kind of a unintuitive, weird champion, and he also happened to be a reprint. And I think it's more the former as to why people were having issues with him, as opposed to just the fact that it was a reprint. But again, I mostly agree with this, especially when you add the recent set part. Item system, I talked about this before. It sounds like they might be doing some kind of augment thing, or maybe just like giving people a bunch of a couple of reforgers on 4/7 if they're getting a bunch of items. That's probably pretty good. I think there are ways to fix this. That being said, I mean, the other thing is like we got rid of armories, which means you just get more items off of PvE rounds, which has sort of, really added to it. So I will be very curious to see what they do with this. I think this is a good thing to fix. That said, I think they didn't talk about the other main item system pain point, which is like we still are in a world where there are certain items that are basically dead and not really useful in any comp. And then some items that are basically seeing play in almost every comp, or at least completely unlock the potential of a unit. Looking at you, Last Whisperer Sivir, and looking at you, Archangel Staff, an item that just doesn't see any play at all. Deathblade doesn't really see any play. So I think there is still some work to be done. Again, I understand that it can be a bit of a large ask to say to developers all of the items need to be good. There are plenty of items, I get it that there are going to be items that are going to be stronger and they're going to be weaker. I just think that it's important that items don't feel like completely worthless, because sometimes you get them off of dragons. Sometimes it's just the last item you have to make, and to be like, wow, this item feels completely useless is just like not a good feeling. So I think a little bit more work to be done on some of the worst items, and then some of the other items that are like, you want Morellos in almost every comp, or if everyone's playing Warwick, you want Sunfire. Like, that's the other side of things, like making sure we're not like basically forced to build a certain item every game. QSS is sort of another good example of that. Spatches and emblems, I talked about this already, so I don't need to belabor that point. Okay, augments. So Mort asks a bunch of questions here, and I'm kind of gonna like tongue-in-cheekly answer them, at least to what I think. Again, this is entirely my opinion, but that's what I'm doing, so that's what I'm gonna do. Is 3 items the right amount of augments to get in the game? That's fine. I'm not really sure. I think 3 augments seem to make a lot of sense. But I'd be curious to see what the game would look like with only 2, or maybe if there were 4. I don't think we should go less than that, and because then it's basically just radiant items. You're just getting like one big decision, and I think more than 4 sounds to just be like too much. It's just, there's going to be so much variance, it's going to be impossible to balance. And like, also, like, are you just making an augment decision every stage? Probably too much, in my opinion. Is 1, 4, 3, 5, and 4, 6 the right stages to get these augments? No. I mean, also why is it 3, 5 and not 3, 3? I don't know, unless maybe they're changing it, but that's it's 3, 3. I'm gonna go with no. I do not like this augment, and I do not like this augment choice. I like 3, 3. Ironic that that's the one that's messed up. 3, 3, really good time for an augment. You've kind of made your decisions about your early game. 3, 3 is right about when you're kind of going into your mid game and making a lot of decisions about rolling there. Great time for an augment. 1, 4. So the caveat I'm going to say when I say no, I don't like the time for these augments, goes back to something I said all the way at the top when coming off of Reckoning about mechanic complexity, and how I think it's important that we understand what augments are trying to do. So if you're going to have an augment at 1-4, so 1-4, you have essentially not made any choices. You have taken an item off of carousel, which effectively is random. Yeah, certain players will favor certain items, but at the end of the day, like, it's not, don't have that much control over that. And you've had one shop, two shops. No, one shop. You've gotten to make one buy decision. So you've basically made no decisions. So this is ideally the first decision that you're making from the game. Now, that is fine if this augment choice at 1-4 is either very generic and can be played in most things, or is something that will determine how you are playing the game for the next, for the entire rest of the game. And this decision should be the thing that you're playing off of. It is bad if the augment that you take needs to be played around in a specific way in order to get any value out of it. A good example, two examples of this are Built Different and Dominance, especially Built Different 1, especially. These augments require you to build sort of a strong board going into the early game. They are designed around win streaking really hard in the early game and using, in Dominance case, the bunch of gold, and Built Difference case, having just this insanely strong board in order to snowball an economic advantage to go into the late game and transition into something else. And again, if you have Built Different 3, maybe you just play Built Different 3 the whole game. But being in a position where, like, in order to use this, you need certain conditions, well, you have no way of knowing if you're going to get those conditions because you've had so few shops, which can be a risk-reward thing, but can also just feel really awful, where you take Dominance and then you get no 2 stars and you're like, well, I guess I can't do anything with this, and not that I've lost the game, but I'm getting no value out of my augment whatsoever. Now, you could say, well, only take one of those augments if you already have the conditions met, but because you've made essentially no decisions, now it's just exclusively luck. There's nothing you can do. You can't roll on 1-3 to, like, make a stronger board to know what you're going to do on 1-4. So you're basically just taking the thing you can. In general, I think if we're going to have 1-4 augments, we should be much more careful with ones that require certain conditions to work, and B, ones that force you to play a specific thing exclusively, as I think that I don't particularly like that playstyle. Again, as I said, I think 3-3, great time for augment. I don't really have any problems. 4-6, once again, as I said before, kind of about items, this can be meta dependent. If we were in a roll on 8 at 5-1 meta, which we haven't really been throughout all of set 6, then the 4-6 augment makes a little bit more sense to me as the sort of thing you take right before you make your last big decision for the game, your level 8 roll down. But for the most part, people are rolling at 4-2 or 4-5 for their level 8 board, which means your 4-6 is going to have to be a capstone. It's going to have to be the last thing that you take to cap off of your board. That's fine. If your 4-6 augment is almost exclusively built upon your board and there to upgrade something that's already there. And they are moving in this direction. However, there are times, and we'll get to this in a second with power levels, with prismatics, where that just doesn't happen. You get a bunch of prismatic augments, and they don't really fit your board. You've already made all of the decisions. You've already rolled all of your gold. You've built a board. You can't really pivot from there. And you're like, well, I can't make use of any of these augments. I guess I'm just screwed. And that sucks. If the augment is going to be at 4-6, I really think they need to be much more careful, especially because 4-6 is the most common time for prismatics. It needs to be something that is going to be good, almost exclusively always good, and very built upon your board. If they move this augment from 4-6 to a different spot, maybe 4-3, maybe 4-2, then that augment can be something that you then have to build around upon your roll down. Again, I know it's meta dependent. I know that you can't always control that, but this 4-6 augment has been maybe one of my biggest sources of pain throughout this entire set. Are augments the power level augments correct? Again, as I was sort of alluding before, I don't like prismatics. I think they are too strong. I think they do too much. They determine too much for the game. And again, it goes back to something I was saying about shadow items. Silver augments are things that you should play around, but if you can't, it's not that big a deal. If you take a silver augment and then are dropped a ton of valuable things for something else, that's fine. Play around the thing that you hit. Play around your items. Play around your item draws. If you take a prismatic and ignore it, you will lose the game. You are not going to do well. They're just so much stronger. And having those two separate things where you have to completely change how you think about silver, maybe even gold augments, and then prismatics, I think is very, very off. On top of it, where people will say augment diff sometimes too often, the fact of the matter is there are augments you can get at 1-4. There are prismatics you can get at 1-4 that basically guarantee you a top 4, if not a top 2. And there are augment sets that you can get at 4-6 that can straight up lose you the game when they're prismatic. It's so much more rare at silver and gold, and I think it's very important that we really look at prismatics for, are they good for the game? I tend to think no. I tend to think prismatics are just too strong and just force you to play too much, but we'll see where we go. Are distribution rules correct? They certainly were not at the start of the set. They are getting closer, but I still do not think we are there to fix that. Doing a data system on top to alleviate the worst case scenarios. Yes. I think something to deal with the sort of absolute worst case scenarios would be good. I think I'm always a fan of kind of having some kind of an out to where you can at least just make some use of something. I don't really know what that system is, but we'll see. Are certain types of augments not good for the game? Yes, absolutely. I'm very glad they're asking this question, and I'm very glad that's something they're thinking about. There are some augments that I just really cannot stand. One, super generic prismatic augments that still force you to play a certain way, I think are terrible for the game. Disintegrator prismatic, electrocharge prismatic. Why? They're just not that interesting. I don't think they're particularly fun to play around. I think they force you to play in a certain way, but they're still like kind of generic, so they're also not really allowed to be at the tip top of power level. And on top of that, I kind of think that if you have something as silver and gold, that kind of means they can't be that transformative because fundamentally they're silver and gold. They're not supposed to be all that big. Then you get to prismatic, where prismatics should be transformative. They should fundamentally change the way that you play the game. And I just think that's the case. Two, I think we need to be very careful with certain types of augments that have these wild swings. High five is a good example of an augment I don't like. I don't think it's good for the game. I don't like the fact that, yes, it's better now that it's gold, but it's basically a bad augment unless you high roll a 2-star 5 cost that you need, and then it's bonkers overpowered. That kind of thing, those swings, I think are really dangerous and need to be looked at. What new types of augment spaces have we not explored yet? I mean, there is, to some degree, an infinite world of possibility. So I'll be curious to see what they're going to go with going forward. But with that being said, I think the types of augments that I like, in all honesty, I like silver augments that are relatively simple, relatively generic, that you can play around but don't fundamentally change the way you play the game. Gold augments that are kind of in the middle. They give you a nice bonus. They allow you to change the way you play a little bit, but you really do need to play around them, but they don't force you to completely rethink your entire play style. And prismatics are at their best when they do force you to change things. When you get them at 1-4 or 3-5 and you're like, oh, I've gotten this completely new thing. March of Progress, for instance. You get March of Progress at 1-4 and you're like, okay, I am playing a completely different play style because of it. Wise spending. I am playing a completely different playstyle, built different. I am playing something totally new. Those are great as prismatics. I don't think they're very good as silvers. I don't really like built different as a silver augment. I think it's kind of a really weird augment there. And I think that's the direction that they want to go. Silvers should be simple. prismatics should be transformative. And the super generic prismatics, I'd love to see go. And the much more sort of out there, you have to play a completely new style silvers should be removed. So that's my thoughts on this. This ended up being quite a bit longer than I thought. I was kind of hoping to quickly jump through this. But overall, I think, set 6, I had a lot of problems with set 6, but I think set 6 itself was a success. I think set 6.5 was a lot more of a mistake, and I will probably do a little bit more of a talk about like why I didn't like 6.5 overall, and many of the mistakes that were made. But overall, I do like that at least Mort and the team are looking at some of the real issues that I think are in the game, and I think this does signal to me that they're at least learning some of the lessons. That said, as I kind of outlined, there are some things here where I think they're learning the wrong lesson, and some things I don't think they're quite talking about yet. So hopefully we'll get to see some new stuff going forward, but thanks for listening in, and let me know what you guys think.